coming to our panel. Though, unlike my two colleagues, I plan to answer all of your questions within this roughly 13 minutes of my paper. So I won't be answering anything afterwards. So my name is Phillip Zapkin, for those of you who don't know me. I'm an assistant teaching professor at Penn State University. So Kiana and I are neighbors, since she's at University of Pennsylvania, I'm at Penn State. The paper that I'm going to present for you today conforms pretty closely to the abstract that's listed in your program, but as I was writing this, I came across a much more interesting idea, which I've sort of expanded into an article form that's going to get sent to text and presentation. So Amy, be on the lookout for that. And make sure it gets in so that next year everyone can read it. The paper that I'm going to present for you today is called Playtime, Temporality and Adaptation in Marina Carr's Phaedra Backwards. I'm starting this presentation with one of the most cliched critiques of adaptation, namely that adaptations by their nature are parasitic, secondary, derivative. While adaptation studies scholars rightly dismiss these, the critiques continue to hold an influential place in popular criticism and therefore in the popular mindset. Who among us haven't heard the immortal cry, "The book was better," after a cinematic adaptation of a beloved literary work? This mindset is so familiar that adaptation scholar Thomas Leach titled a 2011 essay simply "Vampire Adaptation." And in the opening paragraph of that essay, Leach writes, "One of the hoariest cliches in the field is that adaptations act like vampires in sucking the life out of the passive, helpless progenitor texts who enable their existence, often unwittingly or unwillingly, but are powerless to control their excesses." Charting a similar prejudice, Linda Hutchin begins her landmark theory of adaptation by cataloging negative terms that critics have used to describe adaptation, and she even invokes no less an authority than Virginia Woolf. So with so many detractors, it's not hard to see why adaptations might be dismissed. Now, I raise these critiques not to answer them directly, which is a task that's been done extensively, but to examine a play that inverts this presumed relationship, Marina Carr's 2011 play Phaedra Backwards, which parenthetically premiered at the MacArthur Theater in Princeton, New Jersey, if that's of interest to anyone. Carr's play draws attention to its own anti-teleological nature by running the plot of the Phaedra myth more or less in reverse, beginning after Hippolytus's death. The temporal experimentation in Carr's adaptation takes aim at teleological schema that position adaptations as derivative or secondary works, and the implicit lack of originality so often encoded in these critiques. In this presentation, I will examine three key moments in Carr's play which challenge a simplistic teleology and a simplistic notion that adaptations draw parasitically from precursor texts. The play's thematic fascination with time and its relative trustworthiness begins right from the opening scene. Beginning in media res at the end of the mythic story, Theseus enters telling Phaedra that his son has died going over a cliff. The son isn't named in the scene. Instead, Carr counts on her audience's knowledge of Hippolytus's death in the myth, which is a Brechtian technique calling her source material directly to mind for the viewers. Phaedra herself is unfazed by the news, philosophizing instead about life, myth, grief, age, and of course time. There's also cell phones in there, so this is clearly not set in ancient Greece. She suggests a profound, though ironic, faith in chronology, telling Theseus that you'll be fine in a year or two. You must learn to trust time. And when Theseus denies the causal flow of time, saying, "Last night he was alive. Last night has nothing to do with tonight," Phaedra corrects him, reasserting time's linear path. Last night was the cause of tonight, as tonight will spawn tomorrow, and all your tomorrows until the lines never finish. On the surface of it, these comments don't seem that significant, though as the play moves forward, the continual references to time and causality increasingly highlight Carr's thematic concern. However, Carr's handling of this theme is complex and contradictory. Phaedra's stated belief in linear time sits uneasily after an earlier comment that, "I want to mark this evening, this evening melding into all the other gargoyle evenings of my life. Now this remark seems to belie the trust in time that Phaedra prescribes for her husband. If time melds together, seemingly becoming one, then why would Theseus trust it to heal his pain? And while this first scene establishes a philosophical interest in temporality, the play really abandons chronology as it moves into the second scene, which shifts back further in the myth structure than Carr's major dramatic predecessor, which is Jean Racine's 1677 Phaedra. Carr's second scene takes us back to Phaedra's mother, Pasiphae, before the birth of the Minotaur, Phaedra's half-brother. According to Apollodorus, the Greek chronicler of mythology, as punishment for Minos, who's Phaedra's father, not sacrificing a bull as he had promised Poseidon, the sea god ignites an obsessive desire for the bull in Pasiphae. She enlists the Athenian architect Daedalus, who, quote, built a wooden cow, and placing it in the meadow where the bull habitually grazed, he made Pasiphae climb inside. The bull came up to it and had intercourse with it as if it were a genuine cow. As a result, she gave birth to Asterios, who was called the Minotaur. He had the face of a bull, but the rest of his body was human. That's Apollodorus's version of it, at any rate. And this is the subject of scene 2, where we see the inventor deliver the wooden cow and show Pasiphae how to get inside it. Carr's dramatic sources mention Phaedra's family history, but she breaks with her predecessors by actually staging the cow and Pasiphae's lust for the bull, which neither Euripides, Seneca, nor Racine puts on stage. The shift from the end of the tragedy in scene 1 to a much earlier episode jolts the audience's expectation of chronological order. As the play goes on, however, even the distinction between past and present, which is never very solid in Phaedra Backwards anyway, becomes increasingly more ghostly, and I use that word purposefully, as you'll see in just a second. So this erosion of temporal boundaries becomes most violently obvious in scene 8, where the ghosts of Phaedra's past return to literally eat her alive. Late in the scene, the child Minotaur enters with the spirit of Ariadne, who had helped her lover Theseus defeat the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and in death now blames her sister Phaedra for stealing Theseus from her. Phaedra draws overt attention to the phantasmatic apparition and foreshadows future hauntings by asking, "Are all the graves open tonight?" Shortly after, the adult Minotaur returns, and the stage directions tell us that he taps his hooves on the stones of the terrace. The stones open like graves, tombs, vaults, outclimb Pasiphae and Minos. Phaedra's the last surviving member of her family, and they've all come back from the dead to demand a retribution, both on her for surviving and on Theseus for the murder of the Minotaur and betrayal of Ariadne. These ghosts have returned with a violent hunger, literally to consume Phaedra as retribution for the wrongs that fate, or maybe tragedy, has dealt them. The stage directions say, arranging themselves around Phaedra, they surround her, paw and scrape and lunge. Minotaur lifts her up with one arm, suspends her there. Whatever way it is done, she is hanging in mid-air. And in the original production run at the MacArthur Theatre, they actually hung her on a meat hook. So that was how they staged it. As Phaedra hangs center stage, the real violence begins. Ariadne tells the Minotaur to strip the flesh from her bones, and Pasiphae and Minos begin biting hunks out of her legs, back, and torso. And I talked to Stratos last night about how to properly pronounce these two words like a Greek, but I'll probably still pronounce them wrong. In this staging, Carr borrows another element of Greek mythology not normally associated with the Phaedra cycle, namely sparagamos, and homophagia. I'm getting better.
Much better.
Sparagamos is the sacrifice of a living animal or person by literally ripping it to pieces, and homophagia is the ritualized consumption of the raw flesh. Sparagamos has strong associations with the wild Dionysian mysteries, and of course Dionysus was the patron god of the theater. So Carr's incorporation of this ritual into the Phaedra story self-referentially highlights the Dionysian resonances in classical theater. Now, these events in scene 8 are certainly a gruesome intrusion of Phaedra's past into her present, and in addition to the Dionysian ritual, This scene echoes Phaedra's Love, which is Sarah Kane's famous 1996 in-your-face version of the play, or version of the myth, rather. At the end of Kane's version, a perversely lethargic Hippolytus is brutally killed by an angry mob. He's strangled by one man while a woman emasculates him and barbecues his severed genitals, which are then fed to the dogs, before the disguised Theseus disembowels his son and barbecues his guts. So each play features a hanging and the victim being physically eaten. But in Carr's play, it's particularly noteworthy that it is the ghosts of her past which consume her. And why is this important? Well, because it ironically inverts the temporal relationship usually imagined by adaptation's detractors. Rather than the present, i.e. the adaptation, latching parasitically onto the past, i.e. the adapted text, here we have the inverse graphically enacted. Phaedra's history, her roots, the mythology that supports the Phaedra story, cannibalistically consumes her. This suggests Carr may adopt an attitude opposite to what critics frequently envision, positing instead that it's the precursor texts which parasitically sap potential creative energy from adaptations. This vampiric relationship is implied in the scene where earlier textual elements, in this case the characters from the myth structure, parasitically consume the energy of modern creativity represented by Phaedra and Carr's adaptation. So this notion also raises interesting questions going back to Greek myth and tragedy about the role of fate in predetermining destiny, but because I only have a few more minutes, I don't have time to talk about those. So if scene 8 suggests a vampiric relationship between the past and the present, then the final moments of Phaedra Backwards come close to eliding the distinctions between past, present, and future altogether, condensing all time into a single moment. After Phaedra finally confronts Theseus about killing the Minotaur, the stage directions say, "Enter the Minotaur carrying Hippolytus, both dripping from the sea." Over the ceremonially laid out body, the Minotaur tells Theseus, "The wounds on his face are from the rocks, but the hoof mark on his back is mine." What might seem like a passing reference conflates two very different figures from the Phaedra myth. The Minotaur slain by Theseus, and Poseidon's sea bull that destroys Hippolytus at the end of that myth cycle. In emerging from the ocean with the body of Hippolytus and claiming credit for the boy's death, the Minotaur re-identifies himself with the sea bull. Here we have a temporal hiccup at a couple of different levels. The first is that Theseus had killed the Minotaur either before Hippolytus was born or around that same time. And yet here the Minotaur, evoking Poseidon's sea bull, delivers the corpse of Theseus' son. And then within Phaedra Backwards itself, the play both opens and closes with Hippolytus deceased, though he lives throughout the middle of the show. So this closing returns to the temporal moment of the play's opening, collapsing the distance between the 2 points. And this seems strangely appropriate for the Minotaur, whom Phaedra Backwards treats as a kind of unconscious archetypal obsession, representing suppressed awareness of humanity's animal nature. And that's something I talk more about in the article version. Ariadne even says, "He was the original nightmare in vision, slipped through eternity's scene." So certainly an appropriate character to disrupt teleology. Now in a way, all of this temporal play is fairly standard postmodern stuff. In A Poetics of Postmodernism, Linda Hutchin that is, suggests that renegotiating the role of the past as a source of knowledge is one of the key tasks of postmodernism. She argues that we have no access to the past as an objective external reality. We only have access to the discourses and artifacts of the past, which must be fit into narrative frameworks to be made comprehensible. Hutchin calls this skeptical self-consciousness historiographic metafiction. And to me, Carr's temporal play suggests a similar attitude toward the cultural power of mythology, a kind of mythographic meta-theater, which is really the subject of the article version. She does this by re-exploring what it means for contemporary authors to use or be used by myth as tools for meaning-making. Temporality in this play evokes the recursive and reflexive teleology of adaptation itself, spawned by reproducing and challenging the past. But, I argue, Carr challenges not only Carr challenges not only the Phaedra myth itself, but also the notion that adaptations parasitically consume their sources, troubling this simplistic teleological notion by suggesting that the relationship is much more complicated, going so far as to stage alternative models for that relationship between adapted texts and adaptations. Thank you.